Everyone, welcome back from our lunch networking break. I hope you enjoyed lunch and the opportunity to network with all the delegates. We are now going to have a panel discussion that is more like to wrap up and to continue the discussions on we had in the morning. So we're going to have to see again the OEM perspective in regards to the upcoming targets on CO2 emissions, but also some other aspects. So I'd like to invite the panelists to stage. So Ian Melin from Volvo Group, he spoke in the morning, but also Pablo Mendoza Villafuerte from CNH, and Professor Stefan Hausberger from TU Graz, the Graz University of Technology. So great. You are three of you are here. Whatever you. Now let's move this around. Excellent. So the goal, as you said, is to wrap up, to continue the discussions we had in the morning, and to bring some different points of view to the upcoming CO2 emission targets. Now that they've been in place for a few months, but we're still talking about 7 years ahead. But the industry has to start acting now, so it's important to. It's an important topic. What I would suggest, just to start, Ian, you did speak in the morning, so we could see Volvo's position. Can I start by you, Pablo? Just like a quick introduction on how CNH sees the current standards and where the main challenges are.
Okay, thanks. Thanks. To Integer for the invitation. Thank you as well for the opportunity to discuss this important topic, because obviously for CNH and for the heavy-duty industry in general, it's quite a hot topic for these years or for the next to come. Let me just briefly tell you what CNH position is on this proposal. We have, of course, welcome the fact that we will have the opportunity to have a more informed customer, because within this proposal we will have the vector to be used for a CO2 and for declaring how efficient are our vehicles, which is really, really relevant. Also, obviously, we will have, in combination with some other regulations, different incentives to move to increasingly efficient technologies. However, we see some criticalities now on this proposal, and some of these points are basically, as my colleagues have discussed before, the ambition levels, which are really quite ambitious. We consider that 15% at 2025 and 30% in 2030. It's very challenging for conventional technology. We, of course, are leaders in gas technology, and we can see, although that the LNG is recognized in the same proposal as one of the technologies that are reducing the CO2 and reducing some other pollutants, that the LNG per se is not really that recognized in this proposal. However, obviously, left aside this, the fact that the 15% in 2025, being realistic, is only achievable with some level of electrification. So for us, it's going to be absolutely challenging. Now, another point that we see which is important to highlight, is the fact that we are expecting a reduction as well on the pollutant emissions, like NOx and particle number, maybe, in the next 7 years, maybe aligned in 2025. The post-Euro 6 regulation which is going to have an impact as well on CO2. And we have not seen in the proposal any provisions to counteract the impact of this next step on pollutant emissions. Well, in brief as well, we consider that the fees are extremely high. I mean, there is no other way. I mean, we cannot see how the justification that Klaus Steininger gave us in the morning is actually justifying this amount for the penalizations. Obviously, we are hoping as well not having to be and to get into this point and to discuss obviously any payment of these fines. Well, obviously one of the main points, and I think for me and for my colleagues, which is very important, and we were discussing with Yorgos in the morning, was the fact that some of the other strategies that we are looking at to reduce the CO2 will have to be taken into consideration somehow to reach these ambitious levels for 2025 and 2030, like that discussed alternative fuel or the other strategies for the fleets. Okay,
great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pablo. And Stefan, probably it would be good if you could also bring your point of view to the current sense. You were mentioned in one of the first presentations that TU-GRAS was involved with developing Vector, in the development of Vector. Okay, can you introduce how your work with Vector and how you are seeing the upcoming targets?
Yeah, sure. So I'm working at the University of Technology in Graz. I'm leading there the section emissions. I deal more than 25 years now with measurement, simulation, and reduction technologies for emissions and energy consumption from vehicles. And this led obviously to the nice situation that more than 6 years ago we got a contract from the Commission to make a feasibility study how Vector could look like. This was the idea born then with the component tests and the simulation of the entire vehicle. And since more than 6 years, we're now developing the software together with JRC, with DG Klima, and now also the regulation with DG GROW. I think this was a quite successful cooperation, and this was also a very common effort with the industry to set up, I think, a reasonable and good CO2 legislation or regulation system with all the file handling, and so I hope it's applicable for the industry. At least we did our best, and it's good to get some feedback here. About the regulation and the limits itself, my position is that the 15 and 30% are really ambitious, but feasible, I think. And I'm sure that we need ambitious targets, otherwise we never will meet this 2-degree target about global warming. Even with these ambitious targets, I still think we will miss it. But not because of trucks only. You have only this 5% share, but everyone has to participate to the overall CO2 reduction. I think that's simply necessary. I also agree what was discussed in the morning, that we have now a very transparent system. We have all the standardized components tests. This was not on the table before. We have the same simulation routine for the CO2 calculation, and now we have stringent emission limits. And that does mean, I think, that the whole Vector process is becoming more and more important, and not just for customer information, but also to optimize the portfolio of vehicles to meet these limit values, because otherwise it may be expensive, as you pointed out. This is certainly driving development. And hopefully we have developed the system in a way that it's not just meeting limits, but also for customer benefit. I think this was also a point in the morning, that it's important that trucks are not all the same, but different, which cannot be fully reflected by Vector, but I think this is somehow accounted in the CO2 limit regulation with exemption of vocational vehicles and so on. I just want to point out once again, I think that something is missing in this CO2 targets, and this is beside electricity, some alternative fuels which may need some way to be accounted in the CO2 limits for vehicles, no? Because electric vehicle has zero emissions per definition. Also, we know it's in life cycle, it's not really zero emission, while 100% renewable fuels in a diesel engine have the CO2 emissions of a diesel fuel. No? And I assume there can be elaborated some incentives that also maybe more admixture of renewable fuels makes is useful for meeting CO2 targets. Because the option that you mentioned, that you just produce cheap electric vehicles which are then not used, just scrapped, just to get degraded, is maybe not the attractive one. No? So that's in short my position.
Yeah. Great, excellent. One first question to the panel, and then we can also open for questions if you have any. We talk a lot. We talk about like most truck manufacturers now have a global presence, and there has been at least on the criteria pollutant side, NOx, PM emissions, there has been some level of harmonization across regions. And then a few years ago, there was something that took some harmonization back, which was now the US has greenhouse gas fuel economy standards for trucks. Okay, now and Japan has some fuel economy standards as well in place, and now Europe is coming a few years later. Do you think the current CO2 targets for Europe are bringing some harmonization back, and manufacturers will be able to sell the same definition across different continents? Or even if we are talking about CO2 standards here and there, legislation, the measurement tools are different, the legislation is different, the targets are different, and then there would still be differences in technologies. So maybe Jan?
Yeah. Of course, we had previously, of course, as we, for instance, Volvo, that are present on all those markets, we would have, of course, benefit from as much harmonization as possible. And especially, I mean, we have different, it should not be harmonized in that way. I mean, the duty cycle that are used should be different, of course, because we're using the vehicles different ways. But if we could have had the component measurements harmonized, of course, that would meant that we could have certified one engine in one part of the world and use that for the rest. And we are not there. And I unfortunately doubt that we will end up there as well, because there are today too many differences. And I don't see it near future that it will be harmonized on component testing level. So far, there's not one single test method that is the same in this greenhouse gas regulation. So I doubt it in the near future.
Sure. And Pablo? Yeah.
The same line. I think, you see, there is right now some work being done at Geneva level, at the UNEC, where the industry, OICA, proposal from the OICA was basically to start discussing what components, if any, from the fuel efficiency methodologies around the world for heavy duty were possible to harmonize. And I think I concur with, I only can agree with Jan. Right now, we see it very distant. Albeit these efforts, I think it's going to be complex. It's not going to be an easy discussion, and it will take time and effort. But hopefully, at the UNEC level, we will get some sponsorship from some of the contracting parties, which would be interested as well in such a topic.
Okay, great. Yeah, and Stefan, any thoughts?
I also agree to Jan that having common component tests procedures would help already. No? But for example, we use the world harmonized heavy-duty test cycle, no? But this is not used everywhere in the world. And I also doubt very much that US and so will overtake these test procedures. So this will remain different, most likely for a decade or forever, I don't know. What Europe can do, I think, is just by elaborating a good CO2 regulation, where I think we are on a good way to that, or we have it already, together with maybe a good Euro 7 regulation, that many areas of the world copy this regulation. US will not, but maybe Asia, Africa, and so on. And this helps already, I think, for many manufacturers that at least a part of the world is harmonized.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, there are discussions with Brazil. There are, could be other countries as well that are thinking of adopting the vector system, or a light version of the vector system could also be a possibility. But the main part is that, because what the burden for us is the testing. And that, of course, if that could be harmonized, the component testing, that would give us an advantage cost-wise.
Okay.
And also the know-how, because we need to build up know-how on each and every test methodology and rigs and things like that.
Yeah. Okay. Before I consider, are there any questions? Does anyone have any questions for any of the panelists, or general question for the panelists? Okay, there's one here. Could we have a microphone, please? Okay. So the microphone's coming. Yeah, here in the front, please. Thank you. No?
Since you mentioned general ones, I chip in. It's general, but in this particular case, the reference is for Iveco. I mean, today we heard about how difficult it is and so on to reach the targets. But I remember seeing in something like 2010 the Iveco glider, and there I had a long chat with and also I just refreshed my memory with the press releases. And we saw that they were promising something like 10% from waste heat recovery, 5% from CARES, automatic inflation reducing 15% the rolling resistance. By the way, my colleague said about technologies in other markets. I remember seeing automatic inflation in Argentina, of places, in almost all trucks. How comes we don't have it here? And well, then they are wasting money. But here there was a Well, the point is that in the press release it says that that could deliver 15% reduction of rolling resistance. I take your word for that. And then planar heat exchangers, active shutters on the radiators to improve the aerodynamics on top of an aerodynamic treatment. I mean, all this adds to more. How many of these technologies are already included in the trucks, and therefore how many could be used to reach the 15% target, or the later one?
Thanks for the question, Maurizio. I think it's important that you can see that we are trying to check on and to study different measures. You can see as well from press releases from last year that we have presented our zero concept, maybe 2 years ago, in which we are looking at some of the same technologies to take them into the future packs for technology updates of our models. Hopefully that will help in 2025. But you have to realize as well that the market, it's what it is. That TCO for the different customers is what drives the market. So some of these technologies we are able to include already in some of our models, but some are not really even considered anymore. No, I can tell you as well that, for instance, we have invested a lot in our LNG strategy, and I can tell you that what we can see in the future is a race, hopefully, on the market share of this technology, and of course, we are looking at different options that could enhance even more the LNG effect on the market. Now, that leads to another issue. No, I really like one of the slides of the Daimler presentation because it gives you a 360-degree view of the different technologies that could potentially be an option or different roads to achieve the targets. In general, I think everybody is looking to see what can be included. For instance, the engine management, the thermal management, that's something that we're looking at. Options on different combustions is something that we're looking at that will at least ensure a reduction of CO2 and at least compliance as well on pollutant emissions. So I completely see what you're saying, that we have seen this 5 years ago. What I can tell you is that, again, the market is what it is, and some of the technologies can be pushed to the markets. Some of them are not paid by the customer, basically.
Right, thank you. Jan, would you like to add anything on that? How do you see current technologies that are available but not being used?
I would say, as I'll state, all those technologies that are cost beneficial for the customer, meaning that the reduction in fuel compensates for the increased cost, we have already implemented. If there are other technologies, they are today, with today's business model, they don't fly. That's the way. So we don't have any technologies laying on the shelf just waiting to be introduced. That is not the case. They need to. Today, there needs to be beneficial in cost terms for the customers. Otherwise, they will not buy it. That's clear. And with this legislation, there might be the case that we are forced to introduce those, but that means increased cost of the truck, which will not be paid off by the reduced fuel consumption.
Yeah, Stefan, any thoughts on this?
Most has been said, no? But just a comment to cost efficient. The typical consumer, I think, thinks cost efficient is what pays back in 1.5 or maximum 2 years, no? By fuel saving, while the lifetime of a truck is much longer. No? So in total, if you look at the longer time span, then certainly more technologies are efficient, but the market at the moment doesn't take it up. No?
No, not
you
today.
cannot sell it. No? But
No.
with the limits, I think it's the target of the OEMs to produce or to introduce one technology after the other, so that you don't have any big jumps in the costs and total cost of ownerships. And then we should see this technology in the vehicles, and the people have to buy it because nothing else is available, I assume. No? Big challenge, but I think this way it has to work. No?
Yeah, please.
Maybe just one quick point. In that sense, yes, I completely agree with you that in any case, if we have to comply, we will have to comply, and someone has to pay for it, basically. However, coming back to the targets, the problem with the targets, what we have proposed, at least from the OEM side, was considered not ambitious enough. We proposed 7 and 16%, no, for 2025 and 2030, based obviously on a list of considerations that we made that were even going to be implemented into the roadmaps of probably each company. However, with the 15%, I really see that we are risking that we are pushing again, as in the light commercial vehicles and the passenger car regulation, one technology, no, electrification. You can say hybrids is always a component of electrification, and this is not technology neutral. I have heard a couple of statements in the past couple of weeks from DG Growth regarding a technology neutral proposal, and in this sense, to be honest, it's not. Upfront, it should be said, we are trying to push electrification, and fair enough. But then again, it's not really that technology neutral.
Okay, there's one question over there.
Hello, guys. Yes. Okay, from DG Grow, I'm Penny Dilara, you know me. I would like to challenge you a bit. I mean, apart the fact that from the Commission side, we always said that we want to support electrification very much, even to the point that some people have been saying that the future is all electric and no diesel. But I will not comment on that. I don't ask a comment on you on this particular issue. I keep hearing that we need to take into account what the Euro 7 will bring, the post-Euro 6 emission standards will bring for CO2. can you convince me that we will need to take this into account? Why do you think that the emission control systems will require different CO2 standards?
Okay. Pablo?
I can tell you that we have still physics on the combustion engine, Penny, and you know very well that at least the strategies that we have used to reduce NOx, for instance, SCR, you are talking about packaging the engine, thermal management of the engine, all of these will impact your efficiency in terms of fuel consumption. So yes, I can convince you, of course. I can show you data that we will be discussing probably in the next few years, in which you will have a specific impact of each of the technologies that we will put in the roadmap to comply with the next Euro 7, whatever that will be, that will have a penalization on the CO2 performance of the vehicle. That's without any question. I mean, these are still physics, and we still have the internal combustion engine as part of this regulation, and it's possible to do that, yes. And I will convince you, you'll see in the next few years.
Sure.
I don't know if you would like
Yeah.
to.
Okay. This one. Okay. Yeah. Yes. The microphone's coming.
Thank you. Volker Hasenberg from Daimler. Just to give you also an answer to this topic. So, in fact, it's very simple. When you optimize or you run your machine, your engine in an optimized point, then you can say, okay, I run it in the optimized point regarding fuel efficiency, but then the emissions regarding NOx will be quite higher. So in the end, you have to do more with your after treatment system. And then you can do the other way around, running your engine in an optimized emission point. But then you will not run your engine very efficiently. And when we have very tight targets regarding fuel consumption, so meaning CO2 targets, then for sure you want to try to run your engine in a most efficient way. But then you have to have an after treatment system which do more than it has to be to fulfill the tighter emission targets.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Any other questions? Okay. A follow-up one.
Okay, sorry, but I find this interesting. It will link also very well to the session that we have tomorrow morning about Euro 7 or future standards. You're absolutely right. I mean, this is if you only consider that there is an engine and an engine is an engine and the laws of thermodynamics will hold forever. But we have after-treatment systems. And we even have after-treatment systems that now we see do not impose any CO2 penalty. I mean, they're so sophisticated. And I remind everybody that the emission legislation has always said that these vehicles need to be clean throughout their normal life and throughout their normal use. So it's not optimization under a certain cycle or anything. I mean, these vehicles should have already been clean. So, and just to complete the picture, in the passenger car side, we're now seeing after-treatment systems which manage to keep the emissions steady throughout a big range of CO2. So whatever amount of CO2 you burn, you still produce, 40 milligrams per kilometer of NOx, full stop.
Yeah. Okay. Just to give you some artificial numbers. So you're right. You have a direct link between fuel consumption and CO2 emission. 1 liter diesel is equivalent to 2.65 kilograms CO2. This is also just physics and chemistry. There's no way to get rid of this. But the emissions, the amount of emissions by burning 1 liter diesel may be different. So the thing is, you're running your engine, and just to give you an example, artificial number, and the output are 10 of NOx. And then you have a target of 1, so the after treatment system have to reduce 90%. When you then reduce your target from 1 to 0.5, then your after treatment system have to do more, 95% efficiency by reducing NOx. When you then have higher output of NOx from your engine, for example, not 2, but 20, and you have to go down to 0.5, then your after treatment system have to achieve efficiency nearly 100%. And yes, we have after treatment systems which are reducing very, very good NOx emissions, but it's depending regarding the emissions coming out from the engine. And when this amount is increasing because of the machine running in a better point regarding fuel efficiency, then your after treatment system have to do more.
Okay, excellent. Any other questions?
Maybe
Okay.
can I?
Oh, so
Sorry,
please.
go ahead.
Yeah, just as a comment from my side, no, I think it depends very much on where the limits are. No? If you have the limits on a level, Euro 7 limits on a level where we make use of the improvement of the efficiency of after treatment system without need to heat it very extensively or without the need to reduce the engine out emissions, no? Then I don't see a big challenge for the CO2. No? But if you go to 0.1 gram NOx or whatever, then it's a different story, because then you need to make use of all these not perfect combustion settings that you mentioned before. No? But I think to make use of the natural improvement makes sense, no? Because otherwise we wouldn't improve the SCR systems, the combustion. If nothing is demanded, then we would buy Chinese trucks in a few years now only. No? They are cheaper. And in principle, I think that we have to go in the direction with some zero impact diesel engines in terms of pollution, because otherwise everyone drives electric in a few years. No? If you have another story with high NOx, I think then this is really a challenge for the industry.
Okay, and Pablo, you want
Just
to comment as well?
maybe the last consideration on this point. Yes, I mean, I completely agree with you that we have to have, in any case, the limits to drive innovation and to drive competitivity. And certainly we can discuss this the whole afternoon, but at the end of the day, it really depends on the limits and what are the pollutants that we are going to be discussing now. So making as well assumptions of something that will come in the future, it's going to be difficult. But as we know that we will have an impact on CO2, depending on the technologies and depending on the limits. So I am really eager to see the technologies that will have a zero CO2 impact from your side and a lot of data, hopefully, to be able to discuss it with more substance in the future.
Okay. Oh, there's one question here.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hello. I was listening to the discussion. I was wondering, okay, so let's assume that it's not doable. If we had somebody from the rail industry, they would jump up and say, okay, these guys cannot do it. Why don't you invest in us and pass the freight activity to rail? Would you be happy with that? I mean, at some point, this kind of discussions have to start and being more productive. Okay, we got the point. You say it's not happening. We say it's happening. Maybe the truth is in between. But what would be a more, let's say, creative approach is to state the conditions under which it could happen. Otherwise, it's kind of inviting other more, let's say, if I may use the word radical approaches, like forget about truckers, let's invest in shipping, rail, whatever. That's one thought that came to my mind. The second thought is, if you have done an analysis and if there is a break-even point with regards to oil price, so what would be an oil price that would make the introduction of these technologies reasonable and cost-effective at this point in time.
Yeah, would you like to make any comments?
Yeah, the absolute figure for the oil price, of course, I don't have on top of my head, but we have seen previous oil crises that, of course, if the oil price skyrocket, of course, that will have an impact on technologies and alternatives. That's clear. Absolutely. But the absolute figure when things will happen, it's then you need to be looking into the crystal ball, which I will not be able to do. And of course, as you said, moving to other modes like rails and shipping, which are, but seeing the economical growth we would like to see in Europe, and that is by nature the same as in increased transport needs. And I think that will be hard to meet that on already now well-utilized railroad and shipping parts, and that needs to be taken by trucks. Otherwise, I don't see how that could work.
If I just say,
Okay. Please.
That brings us to another point of the proposal, no? The EMS concept, no? The European modular system that would guarantee you as well high-capacity vehicles for either volume or mass. This, your point about the rails is correct in the sense that, maybe it's more efficient. Why don't we discuss about more efficient strategies for trucks as well? No? One of the points that we were discussing with the Commission was the introduction of an EMS recognition in the proposal of the CO2. However, it is very difficult right now because we understand that there is not enough data to justify this. It has been considered in a way that you have already put some certain percentage of usage of the vehicles. I mean, at least the two columns are there. The percentage of the usage of the vehicle in those specific conditions are still to be discussed maybe in 2022. But this is something that we would like, obviously, to promote. And from the side of the industry, we are working hard to see how we can come up with a more constructive proposal that can be discussed briefly. This one point. The second point about what we were discussing in the morning, what's the name of it? The different trucks on platooning. Platooning is another thing that we can discuss about, in the sense, I completely agree as well, in the sense that you have put it on safety terms. However, these are European funded projects that have been investigating really what is the benefit that we can create by these strategies, no? And I think this is something that has to be recognized by the same Commission, in the sense that we have invested on these strategies, on proving that they are working, and they are. And we have proven up to 10% of reduction of fuel consumption using these strategies. So one thing is, how can we understand what is the amount of time that one truck is going to be working in these conditions, and that we will need data, we will need to have some sort of feeling of the usage of the trucks under these conditions, but it's something that we have to discuss it in the next couple of years to see if this can be included also somehow to help reach these ambition levels.
Can I just add,
sure.
add to what you just mentioned? Because to agree with Pablo with this high-capacity vehicle that we have tried to implement, this is an increasing, and I talk about, like in Sweden now, we're going for 76 ton, or 74 and 76 in Finland, coming in Norway. All those high-capacity vehicles, meaning that in terms of efficiency in gram per ton kilometers, these are the most efficient one, definitely. But with today's regulation, with the limits, those are the ones that are being penalized. Since the average payload is, for the limit value calculation, is done on 13-ton payload, and those vehicles are, of course, designed for carrying up to 40, 50 tons. And we have a regulation that actually now will penalize the most efficient vehicles, which from our point of view is very, very strange.
Okay, there's one
Yeah,
comment
I would
here.
chip in a couple of things which have been said. First of all, I agree with Professor Asperger. In the end, a lot of this boils down to the time of return you expect. I remember discussions in projects where I was mentioned 18 months or 24 months of return. And of course, that's more difficult to get. But the point, as he said, is that then you have the benefits for later. So some of you in the presentation, for instance, mentioned value at the end, resale value, which is
That's very important.
it's a way of paying for that. But in any way, the point probably for the introduction of technology is to find ways to valorize over a longer term the innovation, because that is appearing in many areas. And maybe, I recently spoke to people in banks. I mean, in many cases now is the banks buying the truck. So maybe the bank might be the vehicle which values this over the life, while the single user might not be directly willing, so to say. If they see they have the truck in their hands for their whole life, and therefore maybe they might be a tool into this. Another point is the last thing about platooning, which points to the fact that we have a lot of technologies which are not really giving benefits on vector, on the test cycle, whatever. And while on platooning there are issues, because how do you calculate what you say? The glider prototype, just to go back to that, had a solar roof. That one wouldn't be taken into account. And there's a lot of other technologies that might give real benefits in CO2, like, for instance, anything that reduces the consumption of refrigerators, just to make another example, which might be accounted in another way, as you mentioned. So it's something like the eco-innovation on the cars that might be a kind of complementary tool. But of course, as I say, for the solar roof, it would be possible to calculate in a certain way the efficiency and therefore give you a credit. For the platooning, yes, but it depends so much from the user that there, I don't know how, maybe a kind of conservative value could be recognized or whatever. But you basically gave me the spark to say this side could be something like innovations.
And then we have an issue, as you mentioned, because there are, of course, a need for us now, when moving into these tough targets, we need to introduce new technologies. And today, already today, there are things that are not covered in today's vector. And if we have a process that once we introduce a new technology, if that will take 2-3 years until it's implemented in vector with all the process needed, that would take, of course, too long time. So we would like to see an eco-innovation, because if we, for instance, Volvo has a very good technology, we don't want to reveal it to everyone else in order to get it into vector once we introduce it. So first we introduce it, and then maybe we need to wait 3 years until we get benefit. So we think it would be very beneficial to have the possibility to have an eco-feature process so that we can get the benefit immediately. And once that is done, of course, then it could be revealed and open for everyone else. But at least we don't have to wait a couple of years until. So I don't agree with George that I said that you don't see any need of eco-innovation. I see a real need, because there is a time from when we introduce until the process down here in Brussels, until things are introduced.
You maybe know that in our research projects, we have mentioned the fact, the one which is probably running next year, the concept of having some kind of parallel work on vector to speed up the time to have the innovation. But the confidentiality issues, of course, is another...
I mean, of course, we need a fast process for known technology on the level. But we know, I mean, it needs to be fault and quality assured, and there is a process. It takes time. It cannot be avoided. That's why we see, and we have, I mean, just from now to 2025 is 6 years, and 6 years in truck product development is an extremely short period. So waiting another 3 years until we get the benefit, that will not really fly.
Mm-hmm. And then,
Just a big comment just on residual value, because that's a really good point that you touched there. Okay, we've been discussing in the morning, some colleagues have put forward what they are doing in terms of electrification. No? And residual value of an electrified truck is also a risk for the OEMs because we don't know exactly what is going to be, in general, the durability of the component of the batteries. No? And if that will leave you any residual value at all of that truck after 3, maybe 4 years, who knows? So this is something that also, maybe has to be considered sometime by the regulators, because these ambitious values will push some technology in the market for sure. However, what type of technology at this short period, we will have to see.
Good. We are we've met our time, but just to wrap up then, what I'd like is, Stefan, could you just comment on this issue that has been brought, that there's some lead in time to introduce alternative technologies into Vector, and how the process is, and what has to come first? Is the OEM has to have the technology ready, or we need to work in parallel in order to have the technology included into Vector? Can you comment on this process?
Indeed, the process to get something in the CO2 regulation is rather long. No? So even if it's a small work to change Vector, for some issues you have to change the regulation, you have to pass the DSCMV voting. This needs a year or longer, no? Even if you want just to change one number in the source code. I think an eco feature is possible, no? But you have to define it somehow in a regulation. This can even be based on Vector. As Georgo said, most of the technologies can be simulated. You can produce a more open Vector version where you can add with sills, whatever you like. Everything is thinkable. You just have to define the process once, no? Because without the process, you cannot claim for any % reduction. Who should judge this? No? This needs to be started, that it is ready before 2025, if you need it. No? But I think it's principle possible, and this needs to be somehow a shortcut which does not need a DCMV voting, because the process is defined already, and this needs 4 years, I think, until we have such a process.
Okay, excellent. I think we've got to the end of it. So thank you very much again for the panelists. And of course for the audience for some very interesting questions and comments. So we are now off for our afternoon networking break, and we should be back in 30 minutes approximately for a discussion on alternative technologies. We'll talk about natural gas, electrics, hybrids, and nitrogen. Thank you very much.